They said my inheritance was worthless swampland, so I used it to flood 79 illegal mansions and destroy a corrupt HOA overnight. Picture this. Karen Ashworth Banks, HOA president, standing in her $800 Louboutin boots, watching muddy water swallow her entire retirement scam. The stench of rotting cattails mixed with her panic sweat as 20 years of pressurized lake water reclaimed what was always mine. Those rusted dam controls screamed like a banshee when I cranked them open, but not half as loud as she did. See, when you're a recently divorced electrician who just lost everything, and some entitled suburbanite tries stealing your great-uncle's 1923 land grant with fake surveys and bought-off county officials, well, that's when you learn federal water rights, trump local corruption every single time. What would you do if HOA Karens tried stealing your family land with fake paperwork? Share your HOA horror story below, and tell me where you're watching from, because this revenge gets so much sweeter. 6 months ago, I was Wade Thornfield, 52-year-old divorced electrician from Billings, Montana, watching my life fall apart in real time. Plant closure cost me my job of 15 years. Divorce papers cost me half of everything else. When the lawyer called about Great-Uncle Ezra's will, I figured it was just one more bill I couldn't pay. You've inherited 847 acres, including something called Thornfield Lake, he said, like he was announcing I'd won a rusty bicycle. Property's been in your family since 1923, but honestly, Wade, it's mostly wetland. Good for duck hunting, maybe. The 6-hour drive to assess my inheritance gave me plenty of time to wonder if Uncle Ezra had done me a favor or just stuck me with a tax burden. I remembered him as the crazy hermit who showed up to family reunions smelling like engine oil and talking about big plans for his land. Most folks figured he'd lost his marbles living alone out there for 40 years. But when I crested that hill and saw Thornfield Lake for the first time, I understood why Ezra never left. 800 acres of pristine water stretched out like a mirror, fed by underground springs that kept it crystal clear even in drought years. The original homestead sat on a rise overlooking the water, with Ezra's equipment barn and generator shed nearby. And there, controlling the outlet, was the earthen dam Ezra built back in the 1940s for irrigation. The crunch of gravel under my pickup tires echoed across empty water as I explored the property. Sweet prairie grass mixed with that clean mineral smell you only get from spring-fed lakes. My voice bounced back from the far shore when I called out, just testing the silence. That's when the white Escalade showed up. She climbed out wearing designer outdoor wear that probably cost more than my truck all beige and cream, like she was heading to a country club photo shoot, not tramping around a working ranch. Clipboard in one manicured hand, fake smile plastered across her face like she was selling something I didn't want to buy. "Oh, honey, you must be Ezra's nephew," she said, voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension reserved for people who think money makes them better than everyone else. "I'm Cordelia Ashworth Banks, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We're your new neighbors." Turns out neighbors was a loose term. Her precious HOA bordered my property, and she'd been eyeing Uncle Ezra's land like a hawk circling a wounded rabbit for years. "Now, I know this must be overwhelming for you," she continued, consulting her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. "All this wetland. The boundary situation is quite complex, and there are environmental concerns. Honestly, darling, it's more trouble than it's worth." She slid a folded paper from her clipboard with the practiced ease of a card shark. "I'd like to make you an offer. 15,000 cash, close next week. That way you can walk away from all these legal complications before they become your problem." When I actually laughed out loud, her smile tightened like a wire under tension. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but this land's been in my family for a century. I think I'll hold on to it." Her mask slipped just enough to show the steel underneath. "Well, I certainly hope you've done your research on local ordinances. The county takes environmental violations very seriously these days, and there are boundary disputes that could get quite expensive to resolve." She climbed back into her Escalade, but not before mentioning that the HOA had excellent relationships with the county planning office. The threat hung in the air like diesel exhaust as she drove away. That evening, walking the property line, I found survey stakes that sure as hell weren't mine. And caught against the fence, fluttering like a surrender flag, was a set of architectural plans. Willowbrook Lake Resort, Phase 1, 79 luxury cabins. Suddenly, Cordelia's generous offer made perfect sense. She wasn't trying to help me, she was trying to steal my inheritance. The attack came disguised as bureaucracy, the worst kind. 3 days after our little chat, I'm sitting in my truck eating a gas station sandwich when my phone buzzes with a certified letter notice. Cordelia had filed a complaint with the county claiming my dam violated flood management ordinances. According to her, Thornfield Lake posed an imminent danger to downstream properties. Her evidence? A brand new survey showing my lake had somehow grown tentacles and swallowed up HOA land. The surveyor's name made me laugh out loud. Randy Banks, as in Cordelia Ashworth Banks. Her brother-in-law couldn't survey a parking lot without help, but somehow he'd become an expert on century-old property lines overnight. Time to get educated. My old man always said the courthouse is where truth goes to die, but sometimes you get lucky. The county clerk, bless her heart, charged me $5 to photocopy the original 1923 land grant, and there it was, clear as Uncle Ezra's moonshine. Every boundary, every water right, every square inch of my 847 acres plus a 200-foot buffer zone that cut right through Cordelia's kingdom. But here's what really got my blood pumping. Digging through those dusty files, I found a pattern. The Hendersons got slapped with illegal wetland modification 6 months after refusing Cordelia's buyout. The Kowalskis faced groundwater contamination charges, also 6 months after saying no. Every single violation complaint filed by the same concerned citizen. And who rubber-stamped these complaints? Planning director Margaret Chase, Cordelia's tennis partner. I remembered reading about this stuff during my divorce proceedings, how corruption investigations always started with patterns like this. Follow the money, follow the relationships, follow the timeline. The smell of old paper and bureaucratic decay was making me nauseous, but I kept digging. Uncle Ezra's correspondence with the State Water Authority went back 40 years, documenting how his dam was grandfathered under every environmental regulation ever written. Legal as Sunday church. Time for my counterpunch. Jensen. Surveying cost me $1,500 I didn't have, but they carried federal certification, the kind that holds up in court. When Tom Jensen finished mapping my property with GPS coordinates from the original grant, his face looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Jesus Christ, Wade," he muttered, mopping sweat despite the October chill. "Your neighbors have been squatting on federal land for 15 years. Their tennis courts, community pool, walking paths, even that pretentious fountain all sitting pretty on my property. The boundary lines sliced through their paradise like a chainsaw through butter." I learned something important that day. Original federal land grants trump everything local zoning, city ordinances, even HOA bylaws. When the U.S. government hands you a deed in 1923, that paper carries more weight than any modern survey. Remember that if you ever inherit old family land. The diesel generator's steady hum kept me company that night as I printed boundary maps in Uncle Ezra's workshop. Come morning, Cordelia's world was going to get a lot smaller. I called her before sunrise, cheerful as Christmas morning. "Cordelia! Just wanted to give you a heads up about some new property markers I'll be installing today." What kind of markers? Ice could have formed on her words. "Oh, just correcting a little boundary confusion. Turns out your tennis courts are on my land. So's your pool, your fountain, and about half your walking trails." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "Federal land grants are fascinating things," I continued. "They don't care about your improvements or your lifestyle amenities. They just care about coordinates surveyed by the U.S. Department of Interior." "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. I'll have the no trespassing signs up by noon. You might want to tell your members to find a new place to play tennis." By lunchtime, concrete markers decorated their paradise like tombstones. The sweet smell of fresh cement mixed with chlorine fumes from their suddenly off-limits pool. HOA residents clustered around the boundary line like confused cattle, pointing at signs that declared half their amenities illegal. Cordelia's Escalade arrived with the subtlety of an air raid siren. She climbed out looking like she'd swallowed broken glass. "This is harassment," she shrieked across the property line. "I'll have you arrested." "For what?" "Standing on my own land?" I held up the federal survey, waving it like a victory flag. "You're the one trespassing, sweetheart." She threatened lawsuits, injunctions, and her brother-in-law, the sheriff. I countered with criminal trespassing charges and promised to bill them for 15 years of illegal land use. Cordelia's next move came gift-wrapped in environmental bullshit. 2 weeks after my boundary line bombshell, I'm drinking morning coffee when an official envelope arrives via certified mail. The county wants an emergency environmental impact assessment of my dam. Apparently, my 80-year-old earthen structure now posed catastrophic flood risk to downstream properties. The price tag for this mandatory study? $50,000. For a guy living on unemployment checks, that's approximately one mortgage payment away from losing everything, which was exactly Cordelia's plan. But Uncle Ezra had drilled one lesson into my thick skull during childhood visits. Never trust surface appearances. I spent the next morning crawling through my dam with a flashlight, and what I found made my electrical engineering degree practically purr with appreciation. Hidden beneath decades of grass and weather stains lay a fortress of reinforced concrete. Steel mesh erosion control that would make modern contractors weep. Drainage systems so sophisticated they belonged in an engineering textbook. The musty smell of perfectly cured concrete and the metallic bite of weathered steel told the real story. Uncle Ezra had built this thing using 1940s WPA standards that were tougher than anything constructed today. This wasn't some weekend farmer project. This was federal infrastructure that could survive a nuclear winter. But Cordelia's real game plan hit me when I dug through courthouse insurance records. The HOA had purchased flood insurance on all 79 planned cabin sites, specifically citing upstream dam failure risk. She wasn't trying to protect anyone from flooding, she was planning to get rich when my dam mysteriously failed and washed out her development. Time for some water education. My great-grandfather's 1923 irrigation permit gave me senior water rights to every drop flowing through that dam. I'd learned about this during my divorce when my ex-wife's lawyer tried claiming our well rights. In water law, first in time, first in right means I owned the water before Cordelia's neighborhood even existed. On a perfect Thursday morning, I made a simple adjustment to the dam's release valves, completely legal maintenance under my water rights. Reduced downstream flow by 30%, just enough to make my point crystal clear. By noon, Cordelia's decorative paradise was dying a very public death. Her artificial creek turned into a pathetic trickle that barely wet the stones. The HOA's fountain systems wheezed and gurgled like emphysema patients before falling silent. Those prize-winning flower beds started wilting under the October sun, and the smell of stressed vegetation mixed with rationed chlorine water created an ode to suburban desperation. My phone exploded within an hour. "You psychotic bastard! What did you do to our water?" Cordelia's voice could have melted steel. "Morning, Cordelia. Just exercising my water rights. Agricultural permits from 1923 trump your sprinkler systems by about 90 years. You can't just, this is our community, built on water that doesn't belong to you." I watched a great blue heron wade through her suddenly shallow creek, probably wondering where all the fish went. But I'm reasonable. Drop your damn complaints, acknowledge my property lines, and we'll talk about restoring your creek. This is extortion. This is water law, sweetheart. Google it. By evening, desperate HOA residents were dragging garden hoses from their houses, trying to save thousands of dollars in landscaping. The sight of suburban warriors bucket brigading pool water to dying roses gave me more satisfaction than my divorce settlement. But Cordelia wasn't done playing dirty. That night, a county engineer showed up for an emergency inspection. Clearly, someone had paid for expedited service. What she didn't count on was hiring someone who actually knew his job instead of another relative. After 3 hours crawling through my dam's hidden chambers and reviewing Uncle Ezra's meticulous maintenance logs, the engineer emerged looking like he'd discovered buried treasure. "Mr. Thornfield," he said, brushing concrete dust from his coveralls, "this is the finest small-scale dam I've encountered in 2 decades. Your great-uncle was a genuine artist. His official report rated my structure as exemplary and recommended it as a model for future water management projects. Cordelia's environmental complaints got stamped frivolous in red letters that could probably be seen from space. The next morning I restored full water flow not because I had to, but because watching desperate suburbanites fight over pool water had satisfied my daily entertainment quota. But the real victory came at that evening's emergency HOA meeting, where residents spent 3 hours screaming at Cordelia for provoking the crazy water guy. Turns out when you threaten people's property values and irrigation systems, they start questioning your leadership pretty quickly. Her vice president, Janet Morrison, stood up during public comments with fire in her eyes. Cordelia, maybe it's time to stop poking the bear and start negotiating like adults. Round 2. Wade. The war was just getting started. Cordelia's response to losing round 2 was exactly what you'd expect from a sociopath with a $500,000 gambling problem. She went full nuclear. The bulldozers arrived before sunrise on Monday, their diesel engines shattering the dawn quiet like a mechanical apocalypse. I'm standing barefoot on my porch, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, watching century-old oak trees crash into my lake with sounds like cannon fire. She'd somehow conjured emergency development permits overnight, claiming flood risk required immediate replacement housing for displaced residents. The paperwork was signed in Margaret Chase's elegant script before most people had finished their morning coffee corruption with a country club signature. By noon, ancient cottonwoods that had watched my great-grandfather build his first cabin were floating belly up in water that suddenly ran brown with diesel fuel and sawdust. The sweet air that used to smell like wildflowers and spring water now reeked of chainsaw exhaust and the death screams of an ecosystem being murdered for vacation homes. 24-hour crews turned my sanctuary into hell. Backup beepers and jackhammers replaced loon calls. Concrete trucks lined up like military convoys, pouring foundations for $500,000 cabins where deer had grazed that morning. But what finally snapped my last thread of patience was finding Luna. That's what I'd called the young doe who used to drink from the shallows near Uncle Ezra's old fishing spot. Every morning for 3 months, I'd watched her pick her way delicately to the water's edge, ears swiveling for danger that never came. Until now. I found her tangled in construction wire, drowned in muddy runoff that tasted like diesel and concrete washout. Her dark eyes stared at nothing while rainbow fuel slicks swirled around her fur. The smell of death mixed with industrial chemicals made me gag as I pulled her free from the debris. That's when I stopped playing defense and started planning annihilation. My hands shook as I called Rebecca Martinez, the environmental journalist who'd been tracking corruption across 3 counties. When I sent photos of the devastation Luna's lifeless eyes, ancient trees floating like corpses, dead fish painting the shoreline silver, she called back within an hour, voice tight with fury. "Wade, this looks like a goddamn war zone. Gets worse." I emailed her the fraudulent emergency permits with their impossible timelines. Check when this emergency was supposedly declared versus when the permits got approved. Rebecca had built her career exposing small-town corruption that thought it could hide behind family connections and golf course handshakes. Her story hit the internet like a wildfire. Corporate greed destroys century-old wildlife preserve. Environmental groups shared the photos faster than gossip at a church social, reaching hundreds of thousands of people who'd never heard of Thornfield Lake, but sure as hell recognized environmental murder when they saw it. But media attention just made Cordelia more dangerous. Security guards materialized around the construction site, thick-necked boys with earpieces who tracked my movements like I was public enemy number 1. She'd hired protection services to defend legitimate business interests from environmental terrorists, which apparently meant anyone who objected to watching paradise get bulldozed into a strip mall. The smell of desperation started mixing with the diesel fumes. Cordelia knew state investigators were probably loading their trucks, which gave her maybe 2 weeks before someone with actual authority arrived asking uncomfortable questions about those emergency permits. So she hit the accelerator. 45 cabins sprouted like cancer across the shoreline in 10 days. Particle board walls and vinyl siding created instant suburbia where wilderness had thrived for centuries. Nail guns chattered like automatic weapons from dawn past midnight, 7 days a week, as crews raced against an invisible clock. But Uncle Ezra had taught me something during those childhood summers. When your enemy's in a hurry, they make mistakes. Big ones. While Cordelia rushed her illegal development, I was installing military-grade trail cameras in hidden locations around the construction zone. Motion-activated, infrared, solar-powered, the kind of equipment that catches everything without anyone knowing they're being watched. When developers bypass environmental reviews using emergency permits, they assume nobody's documenting their shortcuts. That assumption becomes expensive when every violation carries felony charges under state environmental protection laws. My cameras caught pure gold. Crews dumping concrete washout directly into wetlands, fuel trucks dripping diesel onto protected soil, contractors burying paint cans and chemical containers instead of paying for legal disposal. Each frame represented criminal violations that could shut down the entire operation. The jackpot came Thursday night when infrared footage showed supervisors directing workers to dump adhesive containers into the marsh behind cabin row 12, the same wetland that fed the underground springs supplying my lake. They'd just poisoned a federal water source on camera. By Labor Day weekend, 79 cabins stood where ancient forest had thrived 6 weeks earlier, and Cordelia was planning a grand opening festival to celebrate her victory over environmental extremism. She had no idea I was about to turn her celebration into the most expensive party she'd ever thrown. The weapon that would destroy Cordelia's empire was hiding in Uncle Ezra's basement, locked behind his workbench where most men kept hunting rifles and bourbon. I'd been avoiding that basement since the funeral. Too many ghosts of childhood summers when Ezra would vanish down there for hours, emerging with grease-stained hands and that cryptic smile that meant he'd just outsmarted the government again. The musty smell of machine oil and old concrete still carried his voice. "Wade, boy, every problem has a solution if you dig deep enough." Tonight, staring at Luna's grave marker in my backyard, I was ready to dig. The gun safe had been taunting me for months. I'd tried every combination that made sense: birthdays, anniversaries, the year Prohibition ended. Finally, desperate and running on whiskey-fueled fury, I punched in the GPS coordinates of the lake's dead center. The steel door swung open like fate. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that smelled like victory and revenge, lay documents that made my hands shake under the workshop's harsh fluorescent lights. The original 1923 contract between my great-grandfather and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, signed in fountain pen ink that had outlasted 3 generations of bureaucrats. But this wasn't just a property deed, it was a federal fucking nuclear weapon. Thornfield Lake wasn't just family land. It was designated emergency water supply for 3 downstream counties during drought conditions. Uncle Ezra held official federal authority as emergency water management operator, with power to control water release during declared emergencies. My electrician's brain started calculating possibilities as I read the legal language. Federal authority superseded everything. Local zoning, development permits, even HOA bylaws became toilet paper when Uncle Sam pulled rank. During drought emergencies, I could legally control every drop flowing downstream, including the wells and irrigation systems keeping Cordelia's neighborhood alive. The climate data on Ezra's computer told the story: 3 consecutive years of dropping water tables, 18 months of documented drought conditions that met federal emergency criteria. All I needed was 30 days to file the paperwork. But Uncle Ezra's real genius was buried in his journals, written in that meticulous handwriting that recorded everything from rainfall to the exact torque specifications on dam bolts. He'd been preparing for this war since the 1980s, maintaining his federal emergency status specifically to protect the lake from developers like Cordelia. Every inspection, every maintenance record, every letter to Washington had been ammunition stockpiled for a battle he knew was coming. The old bastard had handed me a weapon of mass destruction disguised as water rights. Here's where it got beautiful. Those 79 luxury cabins sat squarely in what federal law classified as a flood zone during emergency water management operations. Every permit Cordelia had bought, every construction loan advanced, every retirement fund invested, all of it became worthless paper the moment I activated emergency authority. But as I sat there breathing machine oil and possibility, the moral weight started crushing down like lake water. Innocent families had invested life savings in those cabins. Retirement dreams, college funds, fresh starts after divorce. All of it would vanish if I pulled this trigger. The whiskey burned my throat as I wrestled with Uncle Ezra's legacy. He'd given me the power to protect what he'd built, but using it meant destroying people who'd done nothing worse than trust the wrong developer. The basement seemed to echo with his voice. Sometimes, Wade, protecting what matters requires hard choices. I made mine that night, sitting in the chair where he'd planned this revenge for 40 years. Cordelia would get one final chance to negotiate like a civilized human being. But staring at those federal documents, breathing the smell of old leather and righteous anger, I already knew she'd never take it. Some people only understand force, and I was about to teach her a lesson in federal authority that would make national news. War requires allies, and I was about to assemble the most unlikely coalition since farmers and environmentalists teamed up against fracking. My first call went to Marcus Rivera, an environmental lawyer in the state capitol who specialized in making federal agencies remember they had teeth. I'd found his name in one of Uncle Ezra's journals with a note. Good man. Fights dirty when necessary. High praise from someone who'd spent 40 years outsmarting bureaucrats. Marcus listened to my story over a scratchy phone connection, occasionally muttering, "Jesus Christ," and "those fucking idiots," as I described Cordelia's permit fraud and environmental destruction. When I mentioned the Federal Water Management Authority, the line went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Wade," he finally said, voice tight with excitement, "do you realize what you're sitting on? Federal Emergency Water Authority trumps everything state law, local ordinances, even congressional districts. I've seen cases where emergency declarations shut down entire cities." He agreed to take my case on contingency, which meant he'd work for free until we won, then take a percentage of whatever damages we collected. That's when you know a lawyer smells blood in the water. Next came Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, a hydrologist from the state university whose research had been cited in congressional hearings on water rights. Her voice carried the patient authority of someone who'd spent decades explaining complex science to politicians with room temperature IQs. "Mr. Thornfield, I've been documenting ecological damage from unregulated development for 20 years. What you're describing sounds like a textbook case of environmental criminal activity." She agreed to serve as expert witness and conduct a full ecological assessment of the lake damage. More importantly, she could calculate exactly how much water would be needed to restore the ecosystem data that would justify whatever emergency actions I decided to take. The third member of my coalition came with a personal recommendation from the bartender at Murphy's Tavern, Tommy Tank Morrison, a local contractor who'd bid on the HOA project before getting mysteriously disqualified in favor of Cordelia's out-of-state cronies. Tank was built like his nickname suggested, 6'4", arms like tree trunks, and a handshake that could crack walnuts. But behind the good old boy exterior was a mind that understood construction logistics like a chess master understands peace movement. "That bitch screwed me out of a $250,000 contract," he growled over a beer that looked like a thimble in his massive hands. "Claimed my safety record wasn't up to their standards, then hired crews from 3 states away who've been dumping waste in your lake for 6 weeks. Tank provided insider knowledge about permit fraud, safety violations, and the creative accounting that kept Cordelia's project barely this side of bankruptcy. He also offered something more valuable: credibility with local residents who'd known his family for 3 generations. But the real game changer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing property records at the courthouse, I'd mentioned my situation to the elderly clerk who'd been helping me navigate the filing system. Turns out Eleanor Crow Feather wasn't just a county employee, she was a tribal liaison for the Three Rivers Sioux Nation, whose ancestral territory included the entire lake watershed. "Your lake was a sacred site before European settlement," she told me quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "The springs were considered healing waters. Our tribal council has been looking for a way to protect indigenous cultural sites from development." She introduced me to tribal chairman Robert Crow Feather, her nephew, who brought legal resources I hadn't even known existed. Native American cultural preservation laws carried federal weight that made environmental regulations look like parking tickets. "The U.S. government has treaty obligations to protect sites of cultural significance," Chairman Crow Feather explained during our meeting at the tribal offices. "If we can document historical use of this area for ceremonies, your lake becomes protected under federal cultural preservation statutes." My coalition was complete: environmental lawyer, university scientist, local contractor, and tribal nation. Each brought different weapons to the same war. Marcus handled the legal strategy, filing federal emergency water management declarations while simultaneously challenging every HOA permit through environmental court. The beauty of federal emergency authority is that it triggers immediate construction halts, no appeals, no delays, no bullshit bureaucratic stalling. Dr. Whitehorse documented ecological damage and calculated restoration requirements that would justify controlled flooding to restore natural water levels. Her scientific reports would make it impossible for any judge to claim my actions were excessive or vindictive. Tank provided boots-on-the-ground intelligence about construction timelines, safety violations, and the financial pressure driving Cordelia's rush to complete the project. He also helped me upgrade the dam's control systems using my electrical engineering background. installing remote monitoring equipment that would document water levels scientifically. Chairman Crow Feather's tribal lawyers filed cultural preservation claims that added another layer of federal protection to the lake. Even if Cordelia somehow survived the environmental charges, she'd still face tribal sovereignty issues that could tie up her project for decades. The preparation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of late nights in Uncle Ezra's workshop, soldering connections and testing backup power systems while my coalition assembled the legal ammunition that would end Cordelia's dreams forever. The deadline was set, Labor Day weekend, when maximum residents would be present for the biggest public confrontation of my life. With 3 weeks until my federal paperwork became active, Cordelia started playing by prison rules, which meant there weren't any rules at all. The first sabotage attempt came on a Tuesday night when I was in town grabbing groceries. I returned to find my main power line cut and the backup generator's fuel tank drained dry. Amateur hour stuff, really, but it told me Cordelia was getting desperate enough to hire actual criminals instead of just corrupt bureaucrats. What she didn't know was that 20 years as an industrial electrician had taught me to plan for sabotage. I'd installed 3 separate backup power systems after finding Uncle Ezra's journal's solar panels hidden in the equipment barn, a propane generator in the old root cellar, and a diesel backup that could run the dam controls for a month without refueling. My trail cameras caught everything. 2 men in coveralls with out-of-state plates, working by flashlight to disable equipment they didn't understand. Their faces were clear as daylight when infrared strobes lit them up like Christmas trees. Cordelia had hired demolition specialists to destroy federal water infrastructure, which made their little vandalism spree a terrorism charge under the Patriot Act. The FBI field office in Helena was very interested in those videos. But Cordelia's real desperation showed when she offered me $500,000 cash to disappear. The meeting happened at Murphy's Tavern on a Thursday night, with her sliding into the booth across from me like we were old friends instead of mortal enemies. She wore designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my truck, trying to project casual confidence while her hands shook around a martini glass. "Wade, darling, I think we got off on the wrong foot," she began, voice sweet as antifreeze. "This whole situation has become unnecessarily complicated." I sipped my beer and let her talk. "I've been authorized to offer you $500,000 for your property, cash, close next week. You could start fresh somewhere else, maybe buy a nice place in Florida." "Authorized by who?" Her smile tightened like a wire under tension. "My investors, people who understand the value of resolving disputes amicably. 500,000. I pretended to consider it, watching her lean forward hopefully. "That's a generous offer for worthless swampland." "It's not about the land value, Wade. It's about community harmony." "What happens if I say no?" The mask slipped completely. "Then you'll discover that fighting an entire community can be very expensive. Legal fees, harassment charges, maybe even questions about your mental stability after your recent divorce." I finished my beer slowly, letting the silence stretch until she started fidgeting with her purse strap. "Cordelia, you just threatened a federal witness in a public place while I'm wearing a wire. That's another felony." I wasn't actually wearing a wire, but watching her face drain of color was worth the bluff. The character assassination campaign started the next morning. Suddenly, I was the unstable loner with a dangerous obsession who posed a threat to community safety. The local newspaper, which ran full-page HOA advertisements every week, published editorials about environmental extremism and outside agitators disrupting economic development. Cordelia organized a Save Our Investment rally in the town square, complete with professionally printed signs and a rented sound system. 43 families who'd invested in lakefront cabins gathered to hear speeches about how my extremist lawsuit threatened their retirement dreams. What she didn't mention was that her own retirement fund was leveraged so deep in this development that bankruptcy was already inevitable. Tank had provided financial records showing the HOA owed contractors over $2 million, with construction loans coming due faster than cabin sales could cover them. The pressure tactics escalated when the county suddenly discovered code violations at my property. My electrical systems needed immediate inspection. My septic system required emergency evaluation. Even my gravel driveway was cited for improper drainage affecting county roads. Every inspector who showed up carried the same apologetic expression and the same message. "Sorry, Wade, but we got orders from upstairs." But Cordelia's biggest mistake was threatening my ex-wife and kids. The anonymous phone call started on Saturday morning. Sandra called me from Denver, voice tight with worry. "Wade, someone's been asking questions about you at Emma's school. About your mental health, whether you're dangerous." My daughter Emma was 16, old enough to understand that her father was fighting some kind of war, but young enough to be scared by strangers asking whether Daddy might hurt people. When I called her that night, she was crying. "Dad, are you okay? Mom says you're in trouble." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just dealing with some bad people who don't like being told no." "Are you going to get arrested?" The pain in her voice was like ice water in my veins. "No, baby. Daddy's going to fix this mess, and then everything will be normal again." That night, sitting in Uncle Ezra's workshop with FBI business cards spread across the workbench, I made the final preparations for war. Remote detonators for controlled flooding, backup communication systems, and detailed documentation of every crime Cordelia's people had committed. 3 more days until Labor Day weekend. 3 more days until I taught an entire county why you don't threaten a man's family. Labor Day weekend arrived like a storm front you can see coming for miles, but can't do anything to stop. Cordelia had hired Pinnacle Public Relations, the same firm that helped oil companies explain away pipeline spills, to rebrand her illegal development as an economic miracle threatened by environmental terrorism. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: paint me as the villain before I could expose her crimes. The media blitz hit every platform simultaneously. Local radio ran hourly ads about outside extremists destroying family dreams. The regional newspaper published a 3-part series titled "When Environmental Activism Goes Too Far," complete with photos of the cabin families who'd invested their life savings in lakefront property. But the real masterpiece was Cordelia's Labor Day festival, scheduled for Saturday afternoon with enough fanfare to make a presidential campaign jealous. She'd invited state legislators, county commissioners, even the lieutenant governor, all coming to celebrate progress defeating extremism and cut ribbons on completed cabins. 200 people were expected. Local news crews would be filming. The message was clear: Wade Thornfield versus the entire civilized world. What none of them knew was that Cordelia's financial empire was held together with desperation and accounting fraud. Tank had spent weeks documenting the HOA's books through his construction industry contacts. The numbers were staggering: $2.8 million in unpaid contractor bills, construction loans leveraged against pre-sold cabins that hadn't passed final inspection, and a cash flow crisis that made bankruptcy inevitable within 60 days. Cordelia had personally guaranteed most of the debt using her own assets as collateral. If the cabin sales fell through, she'd lose everything: house, retirement accounts, even her precious country club membership. She was fighting for survival, which made her infinitely more dangerous. The weekend started with psychological warfare. Friday night, someone spray-painted "terrorist" across my truck windshield in red letters visible from space. Saturday morning brought a convoy of HOA residents driving slowly past my property, honking horns and shouting about environmental fascists. But the real message came via certified mail: a restraining order preventing me from interfering with legitimate business activities during the festival weekend. Any approach within 500 feet of the cabin development would result in immediate arrest. Cordelia thought she'd trapped me in legal quicksand. What she didn't understand was that Federal Emergency Authority operates outside local court jurisdiction. The moment I activated those water management powers, her restraining order became as worthless as Confederate currency. I spent Saturday morning making final preparations in Uncle Ezra's workshop. The remote control system was tested and ready. I could operate the dam from anywhere with cell service, opening release valves gradually to minimize human danger while maximizing property damage to illegal structures. Livestream cameras were positioned to document everything. Marcus had insisted on real-time footage to prove the flooding was controlled and deliberate, not accidental or malicious. Every second would be recorded for federal investigators who'd arrive within hours. Dr. Whitehorse's hydrological calculations were programmed into the system. Water levels would rise exactly 12 feet, enough to flood cabin foundations and render them uninhabitable, but not high enough to threaten human life for anyone with basic intelligence. The psychological preparation was harder than the technical setup. I visited Uncle Ezra's grave that morning, standing among wildflowers that would soon be underwater if everything went according to plan. "Hope you knew what you were doing, old man," I said to the weathered headstone, "because after today, there's no going back." The festival kicked off at noon with a mariachi band and the smell of barbecue smoke drifting across water that had no idea it was about to reclaim stolen territory. From my elevated position a half-mile away, I could see the crowd gathering around Cordelia's podium, families taking photos in front of cabins that represented their entire financial futures. My phone buzzed with text updates from Tank, who was circulating through the crowd wearing a Save Our Lake t-shirt and gathering intelligence. The lieutenant governor had arrived in a black SUV. News crews were setting up for Cordelia's keynote speech, scheduled for 3 p.m. when the sun would be perfect for television. At 2:45 p.m., I received final authorization from the Federal Emergency Management Office via encrypted email. All paperwork was approved. Emergency Water Authority was officially active. I typed a response that would make history. Federal emergency protocols initiated. Controlled flooding commences at 1500 hours. Cordelia took the podium at exactly 3 p.m., microphone feedback squealing across the water as she began her victory speech. Today represents triumph of progress over extremism, of community vision over individual selfishness. That's when I opened the dam. The sirens started wailing at 3:03 p.m., their mechanical screams echoing across a valley that was about to learn the difference between legal development and federal water management. Game over, Cordelia. The emergency sirens cut through Cordelia's victory speech like a chainsaw through silk, their mechanical wailing announcing the end of her empire in real time. I arrived at the festival driving Uncle Ezra's restored 1950s Ford pickup, its diesel engine rumbling like distant thunder as 200 stunned faces turned toward the sound. The truck bed carried federal documents, a portable PA system, and Marcus Rivera wearing his best courtroom suit and a smile that could cut glass. FBI agent Sarah Chen rode shotgun, her badge and sidearm visible enough to make the crowd nervous, but not enough to cause panic. Following behind us came Dr. Whitehorse in her university vehicle, Tribal Chairman Crow Feather in his official SUV, and Tank Morrison in a contractor's truck loaded with evidence boxes. The cavalry had arrived. Cordelia stood frozen at her podium, microphone still clutched in her manicured hands, as the damn sirens continued their relentless warning. Her face cycled through confusion, recognition, and pure terror in the span of 3 seconds as she realized what those sirens meant. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced through my own PA system, voice carrying across water that was already beginning to rise, "my name is Wade Thornfield, and I need to interrupt this celebration with some federal business." The crowd turned toward me like sunflowers following light, their festival mood evaporating as they processed the official vehicles and badges surrounding them. News cameras pivoted from Cordelia's podium to my position, suddenly sensing a bigger story than ribbon-cutting ceremonies. "Cordelia," I called out, "you might want to step away from that microphone before you say something that lands you in federal prison." Her voice cracked like thin ice. "This is harassment. I'm calling the sheriff." "The sheriff's already here," Agent Chen announced, stepping forward with her credentials held high. Along with federal investigators, environmental protection agents, and representatives from the Three Rivers Sioux Nation. "Ms. Ashworth Banks, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud federal water management systems." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs as handcuffs appeared and Cordelia's legal situation became crystal clear. But I wasn't finished. "Folks, I know you're wondering what the hell is happening to your investments," I continued, watching cabin buyers realize their paradise vacation was turning into a financial nightmare. "So let me explain what your HOA president has been hiding from you." Marcus took over, his lawyer's voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years prosecuting environmental crimes. Every construction permit for this development was obtained through fraudulent emergency declarations. The cabins you purchased were built in a federally designated flood zone without proper environmental review. Dr. Whitehorse stepped forward with her tablet displaying ecological damage photos. Additionally, construction activities violated 17 federal environmental protection statutes, contaminating water sources and destroying protected wetland habitats. The crowd's confusion shifted to anger as they understood the implications. Their retirement investments were built on lies, fraud, and environmental crimes that would void every purchase contract and construction loan. But the real bomb dropped when Chairman Crow Feather took the microphone. This lake is a sacred site under federal cultural preservation treaties, he announced in a voice that carried 4 generations of fighting for tribal rights. All development permits are invalidated under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. The land will be restored to its natural state. That's when Cordelia completely lost her shit. "You can't do this!" she screamed, fighting against Agent Chen's handcuffs like a trapped animal. "These people invested everything. You're destroying hard-working families." "No," I said, stepping close enough for the cameras to catch every word. "You destroyed them when you sold them property you knew was illegal. You destroyed them when you forged emergency permits and bribed county officials. You destroyed them when you chose greed over honesty." The water level had risen visibly during our confrontation, lapping at the edges of cabin foundations like liquid justice. The controlled flooding was proceeding exactly as calculated, dramatic enough for television, precise enough to avoid human casualties. "The flooding will continue for 48 hours, I announced to the crowd and cameras. "Federal Emergency Authority requires restoration of natural water levels to protect downstream communities from drought conditions." Local news anchor Jessica Martinez pushed through the crowd with her cameraman, microphone extended like a sword. "Mr. Thornfield, are you saying this entire development was illegal from the beginning?" "I'm saying Cordelia Ashworth Banks committed federal crimes to steal protected land, defraud innocent families, and destroy a century-old ecosystem for personal profit," I replied, watching Cordelia's face contort with rage behind Agent Chen's restraining grip. "The law is correcting her mistakes." As federal agents led Cordelia toward their vehicles, she managed one final scream over her shoulder. "This isn't over, you psychotic bastard!" "Yes," I called back. "It really is." The festival crowd stood in stunned silence as lake water continued its patient reclamation of stolen shoreline, washing away the foundations of Cordelia's empire one cabin at a time. Justice, it turns out, sounds exactly like moving water. 6 months later, Cordelia Ashworth Banks was serving 18 months in federal prison for conspiracy, environmental crimes, and tampering with federal water infrastructure. Her mugshot designer makeup smeared, fake eyelashes askew became an internet meme captioned, "When Karens Meet Federal Authority." The cabin buyers' class action lawsuit recovered 80% of their investments from insurance claims and seized HOA assets. Turns out Cordelia had been skimming construction funds to cover gambling debts at 3 different casinos, which explained her desperation to complete sales before anyone noticed the missing money. But the real victory came in what we built from the wreckage. The Ezra Thornfield Environmental Trust now owns 1,200 acres around the lake, including land purchased from families who chose conservation over development. The trust partnered with the state university to create a living laboratory for sustainable water management and ecosystem restoration. 35 of the original cabin buyers worked with me to develop an eco-friendly lakeside community that actually enhanced the environment instead of destroying it. Solar panels, composting toilets, native plant landscaping, and strict building codes that required federal environmental approval for every structure. Property values increased 40% once the lake ecosystem recovered. Turns out pristine wilderness attracts more tourists than strip mall vacation rentals, generating sustainable revenue for the entire county while preserving what Uncle Ezra died protecting. The annual Thornfield Lake Conservation Festival draws 10,000 visitors every Labor Day weekend, celebrating environmental restoration and featuring workshops on sustainable development. Last year's keynote speaker was Dr. Whitehorse, explaining how community action can defeat corporate greed when people understand their legal rights. I kept Uncle Ezra's homestead as my permanent residence, finally finding the peace that had eluded me since my divorce. Mornings start with coffee on the porch, watching great blue herons fish in water so clear you can see bottom 20 feet down. The smell of wildflowers has returned, mixed with the clean, mineral scent of spring-fed lakes that haven't been poisoned by construction runoff. My relationship with my kids improved dramatically after the media coverage portrayed me as an environmental hero instead of a bitter divorcee. Emma, now 17, spent last summer interning with the Trust's education program, teaching visiting students about water rights and environmental law. She's planning to study environmental engineering in college, carrying on the family tradition of protecting what matters. The legal precedent we established, Federal Water Management Authority superseding local corruption, has been cited in 12 other environmental cases across 4 states. Marcus Rivera built an entire practice around fighting development fraud, using our case as a template for communities battling corrupt HOAs and bought-off politicians. But perhaps the sweetest victory was Margaret Chase's resignation in disgrace after FBI investigation revealed 15 years of permit fraud and kickback schemes. Her replacement, Elena Vargas, grew up on a ranch and understands that land stewardship matters more than developer campaign contributions. The trust established scholarship funds for local students pursuing environmental science, conservation law, or sustainable agriculture. 23 kids from rural families have received college funding to study careers that protect the land instead of exploiting it. Tank Morrison got the contract to build all trust facilities using sustainable construction methods that prove you can develop responsibly without destroying ecosystems. His company now specializes in environmental restoration projects, employing 47 people who might otherwise have left for city jobs. Chairman Crowfeather and I co-chair the Trust's board, combining tribal wisdom about land stewardship with modern conservation science. The partnership has become a model for cooperation between indigenous communities and environmental organizations. Every evening, I walk the shoreline where Luna used to drink, now restored to pristine condition with new growth replacing the ancient trees Cordelia's crews destroyed. The trail cameras that once documented environmental crimes now record wildlife returning to habitat they'd abandoned during the construction nightmare. Uncle Ezra's workshop still serves as Trust headquarters, where we plan conservation projects and teach workshops on water rights, environmental law, and fighting corruption through proper legal channels. But here's what I want you to remember from this story. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's building something better from the ashes of what they tried to destroy. So drop your worst HOA nightmare in the comments below and tell me where you're watching from. If you love seeing corrupt bullies get what they deserve, hit that subscribe button. And remember, sometimes inheritance isn't money. Sometimes it's responsibility.
You've been watching HOA Stories, where entitled Karens get a reality check. If this episode gave you secondhand rage or satisfaction, hit that like, leave your take in the comments, and subscribe so you're the first in line for more weekly HOA chaos.